So today we're back to work on the C6 competition drift car build. This thing is coming together quick. It was a bare shell less than a week ago. We got the drivetrain in, suspension on, and we got a lot of the big question marks figured out. That is a big thing with any build of this level, a full race car build, anything like that. There's a lot of things that you have to figure out as you go and decide what direction you're gonna take, what route, if you will. So there was a lot of that we still needed to figure out because this is kind of an unknown combination. We've got a turbo LS with a dry sump in a Corvette with a front transmission, so it's just not something we can easily look up the answer for and see, you know, how did this guy do it or how did that guy do it? We kind of have to just try things and see what looks like it's going to work and come up with the best plan we can. And you know, there's always things you want to change later, but I think we got a pretty good game plan of how we're going to build the rest of this car out, and now it's really just time to finish building it. So that being said, first place we're going to start is finishing up our trans mount so that our engine and transmission are fully fixed in the chassis, done and dusted, because we are gonna have to pull this back out, get our clutch in, get our bell housing index, get all that sorted out fully. So before that, I wanna make sure we have this transmission mount dialed, and that's something we can check off the list. Having the drivetrain front to rear fully fixed, good to go. So that's where we're gonna start today. So I'll quit jibber jabbering and we'll get into it. So the first step was to mark and drill our holes into our chassis. We're using these punches that are a given diameter so you can fit them snug in a hole and make sure you mark center. If you're just eyeballing center on a 1/2 inch hole, you can be pretty far off. So we went ahead and drilled out our holes from the bottom, got our pilot holes done once we had our marks, and then moved to the top. So, you know, just limiting drilling on your back, having hot metal shavings land on you. Drilling on your back's never fun. So we finished drilling these out from the top, trying to take care of the paint, and then I went ahead and vacuumed it out. I'm trying so hard to keep the inside of this car clean. It's fresh, it's painted, I want it to stay clean. So we go ahead and test fit our bolt hole. I wanted to make these as tight as possible. I wanted a super tight fit up so that these couldn't move around, and then we ended up putting them in the wrong spot or something, so we accomplished that. From there, it was time to whip out the CAD, cardboard aided design. So I used to never use cardboard templates. I was being lazy. I didn't want to take the extra time. It seemed silly, but in hindsight, I don't know how I ever made it through any project without using it. It just, you can make your mistakes on cardboard, get the gist, and then mark it out on metal. So that's exactly what we did. We're trying to make basically plates that we're going to have the bolts weld into, and that way there's a lot of extra structure there. It's like a big sandwich. We're adding basically a big giant washer that is cut to fit in the shape of where we're going to be landing it. So we dig through the scrap pile, we find this 3-inch flat bar first, 2-inch flat bar second. Looks like the 2-inch will fit, minimize our scraps, bada bing, bada boom, perfect. So we trace out our templates. It's always important when you're making templates to mark the template, and definitely mark when you trace the template onto some steel or whatever you're cutting it out of, the orientation that it's gonna be in, because if you don't, you might not realize that you've got it upside down, and then you grind it, and then you cut it, and it's all sorts of cattywampus. So anyway, we get these things cut out of this flat bar, move over to the old belt grinder. We use this thing all the time. This is an Ameribraid 72-inch belt grinder. I love this thing. I've used it way more than I ever thought I would possibly use it. It just makes everything easier, makes it nice. So from there, we just need to drill out our holes for our bolts. We're gonna make these super snug fitting as well. So I'm gonna show this in real time. With a sharp bit and going slow, look how fast you can blast through some 1/8-inch steel. And that was I'm going in pretty big jump sizes. But if you keep your bits sharp, you don't overheat them by drilling too fast, man, you'll be much better off in the long run. So anyway, we get the bolts in, we put these on the table. I did one tack and realized it was gonna pull it at an angle, which we don't want. We need these to be very precise. So I went ahead and bolted them from the bottom. One of the benefits of having a fixture table, got them all snugged up, went ahead and welded them all the way around. These actually welded pretty good for being coated. I haven't had the best luck welding coated hardware lately, but these welded pretty good. So then we drop them in place. Now my original plan was to weld these in, but that would require grinding back the paint and repainting this whole area. All this is really doing, the weld would be doing, is keeping this from spinning. So I decided, you know what, let's just rivet it in. I mean, it can't spin anyway, and with some rivets, I think we'll be all right. All right, we got both our mounts in. I have them just clecoed for now because I'm gonna either spray all the stuff we need to touch up chassis-wise with the gun, or get a spray can if it's only a couple small things. So I wanna spray them, obviously, the matching color. I was gonna just spray them black, but yeah, so obviously plan rivet them in, because all that's doing is keeping them kind of square and from spinning. That's all the rivets need to do, and then that way, if something ever happens, things get shifted, we can modify it later. So let's let the jack loose. It should come down a little bit because we need to shim the trans up, but yep, there we go. Trans is officially bolted up. We do have to shim up the trans to get it where we want it. As you can see, these bolts should be loose now. Yep. As it slunk down on them. This one's a tiny bit angled just because this thing angles the whole time. This slopes ever so slightly too. So we're dealing with a lot of slopes, not a flat section, but we're basically gonna put it right about there. So I'm gonna make a couple of slide-in shims that'll just, but it's supported now. That's what's important. Sweet. All right, well, let's go make these shims and then we can wrap this project up. So I decided to change my plan of attack a little bit. I ovaled out the holes, the mounting holes, just because both the bolts were at a tiny bit of an angle because of where they mounted. And with how tight I had the holes, it just made it difficult to install by yourself. So I decided to open those up a little bit, and then I decided to grind the end of the mount down. It seemed like if I got it to just lay a little bit flatter and give myself a little more clearance for the flange nut and such, that I might actually be able to fit it without any shims at all. Another thing we noticed that led us to realizing that we could maybe fit it with no shims at all was that the engine was actually a little bit out of level. It was a little bit high on the driver's side. So I figured if we could drop that side down just a little bit, just, you know, probably about an 1/8 inch, that would, one, level things out, and two, again, remove the need for a shim. So hopefully with all of these things, the mount actually fits perfect. We'll see. All right, engine and trans are level. Everything's bolted up. We could have raised that side, but I want to keep the engine as low as possible. We still got some clearance down here through our oil pan. It gets tight on this side. So it's about as low as it can go. Trans is perfect. Engine and trans are perfectly level. We've got the mount squared now. It was a little tricky because of the way it mounts to these. So that's why I ground down the corners some, just so that it was a little bit closer to the inside. And yeah, moral of the story is it's sitting flat, it's sitting flush, as you can see. So trans is mounted where it needs to be. Everything's level, everything's happy. Very exciting, huge project off the chopping block. Now that we got the trans mount done, we gotta pull the engine and trans back out to index bell housing, put the clutch in, make it all official so we can put it back in, and hopefully it doesn't have to come back out. But now that we got that sorted, we can yank it back out. All right, so what we have here is an offset dowel. So these are stock dowels that slide in here. So these are what center the bell housing. The bolts and the bolt holes all have some wiggle room, but these are what align the bell housing. So when you switch to an aftermarket bell housing or aftermarket trans or any sort of adapter setup, you're supposed to index the bell housing because they're not made together. You're not gonna have factory tolerances. You might get lucky, like my Miata, I didn't do it, and knock on wood, so far so good. 3, 4, 5 years now. But on something like this, a setup like this, it is crucially important. So we got two sizes. We've got the larger and the lower offset. We're gonna start with the smaller offset, see if we can get it aligned right. If we can't, then we'll go to the larger offset. So yeah, we're gonna tap these in and see if we can't get this all sorted out. We got our dial indicator base. See how this goes. So we got the bell housing indexed pretty close, plus or minus, I think a total of 5 or 6 thousandths. You can see 0 is obviously static. We go below it and we go above it. Now in hindsight, that means we could have got it closer, but I was happy with this. this was pretty dang close, and from all we've seen, this was good. This was going to be fine. So we decided to start assembling the bell housing. So we needed to get our throwout bearing in. So I had been waiting on some bolts for this. I needed countersunk Allens, and I went ahead and got nylon lock nuts because obviously this is something we do not want backing out because we'd have to pull the bell housing off to service it. I also needed these AN lines to come in because we needed short little lines coming out of the bell housing because there's no way to get to the lines inside the bell housing once all this is attached in the car. So we got that set up. We had to cut off this. There's a provision for a clutch fork if you were to do a clutch fork style throwout bearing deal. So we had to cut that down, and then we were good. Bell housing was ready. So it's time to install the clutch. So we started getting that on. This is probably, it's probably been a dozen times I've installed this dang clutch, and it is a tricky one to install because you really have to just work it on. I mean, you probably go around a dozen rotations to get it to snug all the way up and torque it down evenly. It's one of those things. But anyway, I put Loctite on them, which I was afraid if I put Loctite on them, we'd have to take them back off, but I did it anyway, torqued them down to spec, went ahead and got the bell housing on, and then it was time to try to get the trans on. Now, this is where things don't go so great. It just did not want to go the rest of the way in. We got it into the splines, but it would not seat the ring that aligns it. We could not figure it out. We played with it for a while. So we took it all back apart, took the clutch back off, realigned the clutch, rechecked everything, realigned the throwout bearing because that could have been it. We tried again and again, and our whole goal here was to get it to slide all the way in without having to draw it in with the bolts. And no matter what we did, we would get to the centering ring at the very end and it wouldn't go any further. All right, well, I think we've been chasing our tail on trying to get this thing to slide in by hand. I think we have to bring it in with the bolts. We took the dowels out even and drew it in, like it wants to go in easy with the bolts, but I was trying to avoid drawing it in with the bolts because then you don't know for sure if it's lined up. So we switched to the bigger offset dowels. Then we came back to these and we've got it dialed. So spin it around, Josue. I mean, that's about as perfect as it's gonna get. We go +1, -1. That's it, dude. So we're gonna call it at that. We gotta put the clutch back on. This has been a process, man, a back and forth. Gotta put the throwout bearing back on. Gotta get all that back on, and then we'll get it in. Basically what was happening is we were getting it all the way to the ring here. And eyeballing it, it seemed like it was off some. But what I noticed this last time when I took the clutch off is even though this is a metal alignment tool, it's pretty loose in the throwout bearing. So I think the clutch is just not gonna be perfect. We're gonna have to draw it in, and then when the clutch gets pushed one time, it'll kind of everything reset and center. As long as the bell housing is center, which we know it is, verified, that's what matters. Not, does it feel like it's center when it's going in, which is what I was aiming for. So good to know. It's centered, we can trust it, we just gotta send it. So we wish us luck. We've been at this for like 3 hours, I swear, maybe 4. It's been a while, so take 2, 6, 8, don't know. All right, success. We did have to draw it in with the bolts, but I mean, it was 2 fingers on the wrench, so I'm happy. We know it's indexed, we know it's in spec, it's square. We're good, we're good, we're good. It's bolted up, throwout bearing is in there, lines are out. Trans is torqued to bell housing is torqued to engine. This is official. Should not have to come back apart unless we drive it and there's a problem, but there's no reason for us to take it back apart. We don't have anything more to do that would require us. I'm trying to say this in a way where I don't jinx myself. I'm gonna quit jibber jabber and we're gonna put this thing back in the car, get it all bolted up, and should look the exact same. But see how it looks knowing that it's got a clutch in it and a throwout bearing. All right, engine, trans officially back in, clutch is in, it's aligned, the bell housing's indexed, the throwout bearings in, you can see our lines here. This line length worked out really well. We're going to do some bulkheads and some dry brakes there. So if we ever have to pull the bell housing off, we'll have dry brakes that we can disconnect, and we won't have to rebleed the clutch, which is absolutely huge, because that's really honestly the biggest job if you ever have to do something where you remove the throwout bearing, is having to rebleed the clutch. That honestly takes more time than anything else. So to have dry brakes there, be able to pop those off, drop it out, and not have to worry about it, huge. And I mean, this QuickTime setup is very serviceable in that way. My Miata, it has the throwout bearing mounted to the trans, which is pretty common. So if you pull the trans, you have to pull the throwout bearing, which means you have to disconnect the lines. Whereas with the QuickTime setup, since it bolts internally, we can pull the trans, service the trans, put it back in without ever touching that. But if we do need to pull the throwout bearing to inspect the clutch or do something like that, we'll have the dry brakes. And they'll be really easy to get to up here. They're out of the way. So really happy how all that panned out. We've got the engine level left to right. We've got the trans level. We've got all that mounted up for good. That worked out really well. So really happy with that. Happy to have the drivetrain fully situated in there. So moving on to the next project, we've got plenty of things to do. But I think what I want to start working on, since we're halfway through it as well, is mounting the fuel cell. You can see we've already built the cage for it. Now we just need to mock it up in the chassis and basically make our mounts from the fuel cell cage to the chassis. So that's something I really would like to get done, because we really want that fixed before we start working on mounting the radiator. And there's a bit of a snowball effect with projects like this, a domino effect. You got to do one thing before you can do the other. You don't want to do something, let's say mount the radiator and then shoot yourself in the foot. You can't mount the fuel cell. So you kind of have to figure out where is priority. And just another little tidbit with projects like this, sometimes it's easy to get overwhelmed and think, man, we still got to do this and we still got to do that and we still got to mount this and we still got to figure that out. But the key is just, at least for me, take it one project at a time, right? Don't look at the whole picture. Just take it one project at a time. Take it one checklist, one checkbox at a time, and it'll honestly be done before you know it doing it that way. So that's what we're going to do. Let's get this fuel cell mounted up. So we started out by mocking up the fuel cell in its location. We knew the gist of where we wanted to put it, but we wanted to kind of shim everything up, have it where we had all our proper clearances, and then start measuring for our mounts. Now this was a tough project. I wasn't quite sure exactly how I wanted to do it, how I wanted to mount it. So one of these projects like this, you just got to get working. So we just started cutting pieces. We measured for our front legs because those are going to be the easiest, since they were just going to land, boom, straight down, simple enough. We got the first one cut. We wanted to check and make sure that worked. We had to account for the thickness of the flange that we were going to have to put on the bottom. We needed a leg on the bottom to bolt it in with, right? So we got that all squared away, and we went ahead and marked and cut out our pieces of flat bar, which are going to be the stands for our legs to mount them into the chassis. So we went ahead and cleaned everything up on the old belt grinder. Typical cleaning session. I always like to just take everything down to shiny bright metal, because when you end up painting it anyway, it just makes your life a lot easier if you don't have scaly rust or mill scale on there, and it makes it easier to weld since we are going to TIG weld this. So that's what we started doing. We went ahead and tacked our legs onto our little plates. So this was pretty easy since these just sat straight up. One important thing to note when you're doing something like this is if you weld just one side or the other, when you're welding to a flat plate or something, you can pull and angle one side up. So you have to really think about where you want to start welding, so that way it either pulls the direction you want it to or doesn't pull at all. So we went ahead and put these back in here. We had taken our shims out and they ended up being the perfect height. So now it was time to move on to the rear. Now the rear legs are going to be a lot trickier because these have to angle out to then land on the frame rail. So this is one of those things you can kind of measure for, but you can't really tell exactly what needs to be done until you cut a piece and see. So we cut our first piece. It wasn't quite right. We needed a little bit different angle and we needed a matching angle on the bottom. So we cut another piece. We got it right. We were happy with it. So we went ahead and copied it, boom, for the second one. And then it was just a reverse process all over again. So we go ahead and get these cleaned up on the belt grinder and then test fit them. And what do you know? They actually fit really good. This was definitely going to be one of the most challenging parts of this project to get these nailed down right. Now, obviously, there's the thickness of the plate that we're about to tack on. And I did account for that. The fuel cell was a little low in the back, so with the plate, it would have put it absolutely perfect. So we went ahead and tacked those on. A little bit trickier than the first ones because they're at an angle, so we had to use this magnet to hold them in place. At least welding steel, most of the stuff I TIG weld is either stainless or aluminum, which neither are ferrous, neither can you stick a magnet to? So trying to hold stuff in place gets really tricky, but when you have the option to just stick a magnet to it, makes things a lot easier. So we got those 2 base plates welded up, and then went ahead and marked and drilled our holes for our mounting tabs. It was going to be a lot easier to drill them while they're just little pieces that we can clamp in the vise than once they're all tacked into the frame. So once that was done, then we could actually tack them in the frame. Now this is, again, tricky. We've got to get them just right using the magnet once again. Again, very convenient, especially on these angled ones. But we get them all positioned, we get them all tacked, just a few light tacks in case we mess it up and we need to change them or go back and cut a tack and refit them. And then it's time to test fit. With fabricating anything, there is a lot of test fitting. Now, the fuel cell is really tight in the top of the bracket. It kind of sucks down up by the flange, so the bracket's a little tight at the bottom and a little big at the top. So it can be a bit of a chore to get it in, but we got it test fitted back in there. We've got the legs on, we got our holes on, everything looks good. So now we can just weld it out. So we want to be careful here, again, to make sure we don't weld one spot that's going to pull the leg one way or the other. These really need to all sit flush and level. So we're trying our best to just work around and weld where we need to kind of keep them from warping, or if they do warp, they warp in a direction where it's not that big of a deal. So the next project, with that being done, was to build an under support. Now this thing is supported on the flange and on the box, but we don't want to rely just on that flange to carry the weight, especially with 8 gallons of fuel in there, 4 fuel pumps. It's going to get heavy quick. So we built some strapping to go on the bottom as a lower support. So we marked it, marked our bends, went ahead and bent it in the Swag Off-Road press brake, and it fit pretty much perfect. So we went ahead and got those tacked in, made sure they were all square and level, and everything was still good as it was when we first mocked it up. And then we went ahead and welded those out as well. So these were pretty straightforward to weld out. The top bars were at a little bit of an angle from the tacking and not tacking on the inside as the box fit tight, but all in all, it really wasn't too bad to weld these out. And we tried to make sure we got a lot of weld on them since they are going to be supporting the weight of the cell. Now, the one thing we did need to do is, since we were welding these on the outside of the box because we had to, because there wasn't room to weld them on the inside of the box, we welded in some bar stock along the sides to basically take up the space that would otherwise be there between the box and the cell. And then we could test fit again. You're going to hear the word test fit a lot. There's a lot of test fitting. So we test fitted the box back in with the cell, and everything fit as it should. Very, very happy with this. All right, well, cell is officially mounted. Still a couple things to do, but I'm really happy with how this basket turned out. I was dreading this project. I don't know exactly why. I guess partially just because it's not that exciting of a project, but it was also pretty challenging, you know. The lengths of these had to be absolutely perfect to get it level, and, you know, there's variation, and it was definitely a little tricky, but I'm really happy with how we've got it. We got it tucked up against the firewall. The packaging is nice and compact. It all worked out well. So we do have one more thing to do before we can call this thing done and dusted. Aside from mounting it, we need something to hold the tank in, right? So right now it's just sat in there with gravity. We need something to capture it. Now normally they'll run straps across the top here, but then we would need bolts on the backside. We wouldn't be able to get to the bolts with the basket in the car. I want to be able to remove this and leave the basket here. So what we're going to do is put some angle here, have it bolt in from the side, and that'll capture this lip and hold it in place. That's the plan, at least. So we started out by cutting our pieces of angle to length, basically the same length as the bar stock on the side. And then we went ahead and tossed them in the, you guessed it, the belt grinder. Grinding a piece of angle on the belt grinder can be a little bit tricky, especially trying to get to the inside. It's not really necessary to get to the inside, especially since we aren't going to be welding these. But, you know, I like trying to take all the nastiness off. So then we went ahead and marked our holes. So these had to be pretty much perfectly center in this bar stock because otherwise the rib nut would not fit. Then we drilled our holes, we installed our rib nuts. I'm trying out my new power rib nut tool that hooks to a drill. It's a little tricky to get it right. You don't get that same feel that you get when you're doing it by hand. But we went ahead and put some transfer punches in, put a spacer to mimic the fuel cell being there, tapped them, got our transfer punches to transfer onto the piece of angle so that we could perfectly drill the holes so that way this thing would squish the fuel cell but not be too tight but not be too loose. This is another thing, it's got to be pretty precise, otherwise it's not really going to do its job all that well. So this way we went ahead and drilled out the holes through the angle to then bolt it into the rib nuts. And then it was finally time to paint it all up. Now we had just had a typical Florida thunderstorm where it was sunny and raining, and now it was sunny. I thought we were all good. All was well. We were good to paint this thing. So we went ahead and painted it outside using my signature paint booth, the concrete bench in the middle of my yard. And then while we were waiting on it to dry, we decided to go ahead and basically clear vinyl our door bars on the cage just to keep them protected because they're going to get beat up getting in and out. So I went ahead and tapped the fuel cell back into the mount. Now that it's painted, hopefully this thing doesn't have to come back out. I'm sure it will. We've taken it in and out a dozen times. We bolt our hold down brackets on. They fit perfect. We put it back in the car, and what do you know? It's all done. All right, fuel cell mount is painted. The rain, man. It was kind of still drizzling, but sunny when I first painted it. And then we came inside, we shut the garage door. I looked out the window and it was raining 5-10 minutes after we painted it. Luckily, the paint dried quick enough, it didn't ruin it. But overall, very happy with how this came out. I'm happy with these hold down brackets. Those honestly panned out really well. They just kind of sandwich it perfectly. They're easy to get on and off, but they hold it. It was definitely tedious, time consuming, but very rewarding. I'm super happy to have that checked off the chopping block. It's like eating your least favorite thing first, you know? Like knocking out the projects I'm not super enthused about first, getting those out of the way, and then we get into fun stuff. So besides that, we got the steering column in. That was a big thing we needed to get in just to figure out stuff with the turbo kit, you know, how we're planning on doing it, because that could be in the way, could not be in the way. So we wanted to have that fixed in its location just to help kind of plan this turbo setup out, because it's gonna be pretty elaborate. So there are a couple ideas there. I think maybe next episode we'll go into all the different ideas and the thought process and see what you guys think. But for now, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up. I hope to see you guys next time. But for now, that's it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Goodbye.